Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final webinar of this year's AGM Preclinical Translational Science webinar series. I'm Serene Markosian. I lead the Assay Guidance Manual program here at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, NIH, and really delighted today to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Christopher Austin. Dr. Austin is a CEO partner at Flagship Pioneering in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he's CEO of one of Flagship's franchise companies, Visalis Therapeutics, which is commercializing a novel platform to systematically develop treatments for common diseases. Before joining Flagship in 2021, Dr. Austin served for almost a decade as the founding director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, the center that we're part of. So we're really excited to have him with us today. Here at NCATS, he formulated the strategic vision and scientific directions of the new center and led its effort in developing, demonstrating, and disseminating scientific and operational advances across the spectrum of translational science. Before joining NCATS, he founded and directed scientific and technology initiatives at the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH, where he derived biological insights and therapeutic potential from the human genome. And he came to NIH from Merck, actually, where he worked on genome-based discovery of novel targets and drugs. Dr. Austin received his AB in biology from Princeton and his MD from Harvard Medical School. He did clinical training in internal medicine and neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital and completed a research fellowship in genetics at Harvard. He will talk to us today about preclinical translational science and the view from biotech. We will take Q&A questions. So if you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end of the talk. All right, so on behalf of everyone here at NCATS and all of our attendees, Chris, we're really excited to have you here. And I'll give you the stage now. Please go ahead and share your slides. We look forward to your presentation.
Will do. Okay. You can see all that, right?
Yes, it is not in presentation mode though. So.
No. Okay. So it's really wonderful to be with you. What a privilege, a treat it is for me to be back with the AGM team and crew. It's such an important initiative that I had a small role in playing when it started many years ago now. And what Serene asked me to do is not talk about science, which is what I like to do more than anything else, but give you a sense of, I guess one could say, what I've learned in the last 2.5, 3 years from biotech. And I'm going to apologize in advance for what are unavoidable generalizations. Almost everything I say, there will be exceptions to the rule, but there are things that, from my point of view, generally hold true about the various sectors in what we try to do in preclinical translational science. So I'm going to start out with an unapologetically personal view, so you can see where I'm coming from here. Serene mentioned some of this, but I've been really fortunate in my career to operate in academia, in the government, in big pharma, and most recently in startup biotech and venture capital. And what I've learned, among other things, of working in these 4 divisions is that they all, I can make this go forward. Yeah, they all want to do what NCATS was started out to do, right? Which is to get more treatments to more patients more quickly. That really is what at least the drug development and translational side of academia and government and big pharma and startup biotech and venture capital we're all trying to do that in our own ways. And we all contribute in really important and complementary ways to this mission. And one of the things that I think has struck me, it's probably struck a lot of you, is that like many things in human endeavor, each of these sectors sometimes like to pretend that they can do it all by themselves. And the reality is that they are inextricably interdependent and should be. That's when the ecosystem works best. And the only part of this ecosystem that I had not had direct experience with is in the upper right corner, and that's really the view that I'm going to bring you today. But I want to put it in context of where you may be at one, or perhaps have been at more than one of the three. So just to introduce this, the R&D ecosystem we're talking about is quite diverse. Has lots of different pieces to it. The pieces that I think all of us originally started in, we know well, which are the academic research institutions, and we all have that in common. But that is the only piece of this that all of us have in common, because we wouldn't be where we are if we had gotten through academic research institutions. So I think we all understand how academic institutions work, how people are rewarded, et cetera. And some of us have had the privilege of working at NIH, which has some overlaps with academic research institutions, but of course it's a large funding organization as well that supports the rest of the ecosystem, particularly the academic research institutions. And you'll notice next to the academic research institutions, there's something called startups, and we might, that's a brand or a form of biotech. The problem with biotech is, of course, it's extraordinarily broad. There's about 3,000 companies at least that are within this biotech space, and they range from less than 10 people with a very small budget all the way up to companies like Genzyme before it got bought, which is much larger. But most of them start as little startups having some connection with academic research institutions. And then, of course, the other piece of the startups that's sort of curiously far away on this graph or this diagram is venture capital. You see in the upper right, or the top upper right corner there, because that's where most of the money for the startups come from. And I'll get back to that. And then in the middle there are the biopharma research companies, the ones that we all know about, Merck, Pfizer, Novartis, et cetera, who tend to be the ultimate consumers of all of this and are the ones who make, of course, the majority of the products that eventually get to the patients there in the lower right corner. But none of this would happen without all of these working together. And I'm going to finish with a more diagrammatic map of this. A lot of you have seen, which I think is really critical for people to understand how all the science goes together. This shows you how all the pieces, all the different institutions work together, and they really do. At best, they work together in really synergistic and additive ways. But I always like this makes it look like everybody's working together in a big happy family and they all have the same point of view. The fact is that the translational landscape, like this wonderful New Yorker cover from a number of years ago, and you can tell how many years ago it was by looking at the price in the upper right corner there, that the landscape looks different depending on your point of view. And if you haven't seen this target, this cover, this is a somewhat apocryphal, although in my experience largely accurate, view of how a native New Yorker thinks about the world. That most of the world is between 9th and 10th Avenue and the Hudson River, and then there's this thing called New Jersey on the other side, and then Kansas City someplace, and then there's Japan and China. So those things are out there, but you don't really think about them on a daily basis. And of course, someone in Japan is going to have the opposite point of view. And we all tend to operate from our own keyhole view of how this ecosystem works. And within our ecosystem, there are many different players, all of whom have a contribution to make, but they really have quite different immediate goals, immediate incentives, immediate rewards, immediate desires. Of course, in the end, we all want to get more treatments to more people more quickly, but they all have a different role within this ecosystem. and they tend to misunderstand each other. They tend to use different language. They tend to be a little suspicious of the others, and that seems to be a feature of human nature, that we tend to be suspicious of each other. Sometimes for good reason, but largely just because we don't understand the other members of the ecosystem. But all of these, or most of them at least, are necessary to get any treatment actually developed to all the patients who need it. And so most recently, I've been in the bottom right there. I didn't want to pick out any particular company, so I just listed the Biotech Innovation, the Biotech Innovation Organization, and the National Venture Capital Association, pharma, et cetera. But the bio part of this ecosystem. So I'm going to take you through this kind of slowly, and because it summarizes observations that I think generally hold true about these four sectors, and they're compare and contrast. And again, my apologies in advance for the generalizations. And every one of these, you're going to be able to think of exceptions, but I think largely these hold true. So the first is, I get asked a lot, gosh, how different is it, being in startup biotech? And it's different. Don't get me wrong, it's different, but we all have the same ground truth. No matter where you are, science is science is science is science, and there is a common lingua franca that all of these speak, and that ties us all together. And I found that is no different no matter where we go. Of course, the nature of the sciences can be different, et cetera. But the general scientific training and focus on rigorous science as the basis of developing new treatments for human disease is universal. And the goal, as we said before, the goal broadly stated, right, is improvements in health. That's really why we're in this business in the first place. What is the raison d'etre of at least the translational part of academia? Of course, there's a lot of other parts that are not focused on health, and that's fine, and government too. But the parts that we're talking about, we're all trying to use science to improve health. That's really why we all got into this business in the first place, and didn't do something else with our lives. And I've always thought, as a little sidebar, we are incredibly privileged to do what we do, and no matter what sector we work in. I interact with folks all the time who work in other industries or other kinds of jobs, and they're universally jealous of us because what we do is important. It's important, and sometimes in the Sturm und Drang of what we do, we lose track of that. But we really are very privileged to be able to do what we do. So those are the similarities. So what's different? It's really interesting. So I would put this in a couple of different ways. The measure of success in academia, the product, if you will, is knowledge. That's what academia produces, instantiated in scientific publications, which is the coin of the realm. So it's knowledge. But it's not necessarily useful. It's interesting. It's not necessarily useful, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why it's called curiosity-driven research, for heaven's sake. And that's really, really important, but it's knowledge. Government, the knowledge certainly is part of this, but what does government do that other pieces can't? It's really ecosystem support and change. How do we change how the entire system works? Because that's what government tends to do. That NIH supports the vast majority of biomedical research in this country, and a lot abroad as well. And if you think about the regulatory agencies, they are also supporting and changing various parts of the therapeutic development ecosystem. In biotech, the measure of success is value creation, full stop. And what I mean by that is money. Let's just be very clear here. And the reason for that is that is where the resources come from to do the work in the first place, right? So the scientists in biotech are just as committed scientists and just as rigorous scientists. But they also have this mandate from their funding sources, which is different from NIH or the government or nonprofits, which is that that their funders need a return. And I always like to remind people that all of us have. If you begin to look down on this, which so many people do, I always remind people that, well, gosh, we probably all have a retirement account, and in that retirement account are undoubtedly biotech and pharma stocks. So we all have an interest in value creation because that's how our economy works. But it's a different way of thinking and a different time scale, I would say, than exists in academia or in government or in big pharma. So in big pharma, certainly value creation is huge, right, for the shareholders. But the difference is that pharmaceutical companies, almost by definition, have products. So what creates value for them are selling their products. So sales, earnings that come from that. The vast majority of biotechs have no products. They are, as someone say, they're a giant bonfire for investors' cash, because they have no way of generating. They have no products. So what they're doing is generating intellectual property. They're generating early stage assets. They're generating a platform which has potential, and they have to continue to demonstrate the value of that platform, of those products, independent of them being on the market. So that's a fundamental difference between biotech and pharma. There are a few biotechs that have products. There's no pharmas that I'm aware of that don't have products, but there's a fundamental difference which drives the returns, because pharma can fund a lot of what it does, most of what it does, from sales of ongoing drugs. Biotech can't do that. It's absolutely dependent on investors. So the metric, I mentioned this before, the metric, so the measure of success in metrics is a little bit different. So in academia, is what the coin of the realm is something being interesting. We always talk about that in NIH grants. What's your innovation score that you get on a grant? Whereas in biotech and in pharma, it's either that it's useful or it's valuable. And there's a lot of things which, particularly in the drug world, which are really useful and really valuable that aren't terribly interesting. That is, if you think about a drug that has an improved PK profile, so that a patient can take a drug once a month instead of once a day, that is hugely useful, hugely valuable. And maybe the technology to allow you to do that is interesting, but it's not going to get a big score probably from an NIH grant, but it's incredibly useful. And so the value, the metrics of what's important is useful. The thing I loved about being in government was that that you had to do things which are useful and interesting, but it had to be important to public health, and that was very, very clear from what everybody did, and so it's something that ecosystem thinking is something that is really the privilege of folks in government. So who directs the work? Well, academia, for the most part, of course, it's the PI. You're self-directed. In government, you have a lot of bosses. I always used to say when I was director of NCATS, I had 536 bosses. I had all 435 members of the House, all 100 members of the Senate, and all members of the executive branch too. And that's okay. That's how our representative government works. But it's a community sort of direction. And of course, we have a lot of direction within government to implement that. But don't get me wrong there. But it's not ab initio self-directed. In biotech, there is a lot of self-direction, and of course, some of this comes from people who leave academia to start biotechs. But what one can do is, of course, dependent on funding in biotech, just like it is in academia. So you can have a great idea in academia. If you can't get a grant to support it, you can't do it. Same thing within biotech, except the investors, if you will, in quotation marks, are different. They're investors who, for the most part, again, generalizing, are investing in biotech because they think it's a way to make return for their investors, or for their own investors, or for themselves, and that's the role, of course, of biotech, and that's a little bit different from academia. So it has to be useful or valuable, not just interesting. And in pharma, of course, famously, direction tends to come fairly top down from management. Of course, often a lot of independent ability, self-direction lower down, but it's by design a more management-driven kind of environment. So when you're thinking about what you want to do, ask yourself, well, what kind of a person are you? I got to say, after having worked in all four of these, I love all of them. They just have different advantages and disadvantages that I find, from an ecosystem standpoint, really quite interesting. So another big difference, rate of change. So in academia, things tend to change pretty slowly, but sometimes you get a big transformational gift from a philanthropist. You get $100 million gift, and that could just be transformational, right? Something can happen overnight. It can also happen, and we've all had this experience if you've had NIH grants, large ones, where if you get an NIH grant, a program project or something, that can completely change your life overnight. But generally, the progress is fairly slow and incremental. In government, let's just say it, the change is slow. Sometimes that's by design, and actually that's how our framers designed the system. Sometimes it can be kind of frustrating, as we all know, but the rate of change is relatively slow. In biotech, it's really fast. It is mind-bendingly fast, and that can be a little discombobulating. It's like it can feel like you're in a roller coaster ride all the time, sometimes without your seatbelt fastened, and you just that can be a great thing, because of course things can get better really fast. They can also get worse really fast, and those of us who enjoy change and enjoy novelty thrive in this environment. Other people for whom change is challenging might not do so well in that environment. Change within pharma, again, tends to be slow, right? Tends to be slow, but we're all familiar with big pharma layoffs or starting new divisions, but more publicly. We're all familiar with this, so large layoffs or acquisitions where the change can be punctuated. Can be fairly assaultatory. The change can happen, but for the most part, it's a more measured rate of change. And the last is resources. So academia is an interesting one, where the individual PIs, most of them are fairly modestly funded. There are some PIs who are very, very, very well funded. And academic institutions in general are, at least the R1s, the top level ones, are extremely well funded and wealthy institutions. The ones that we all know about, Harvard and its congeners. But there are a lot of R2 institutions which are less well resourced. So it's quite variable. In government, the resources are large. And the way the government works is it's not based on zero-based budgeting, it's based on the last year. So the budget always goes up every year, with rare exceptions. So it's the only environment I know of where the budget essentially always goes up, and where you may have followed this, but in government vernacular, to a great degree, if the budget doesn't go up, it's termed a cut in the press, because it is a cut relative to the increase that normally happens, and it's expected. It's a really interesting sort of use of vernacular there. So it's large and consistent. That can be a great thing. I mean, for heaven's sake, for the NIH budget, that's been an amazing thing, that large and consistent, relatively consistent budget. In biotech, it is very small. Startup biotech, very small. and can be quite inconsistent. And it depends on the state of the capital markets, and I'll get back to that. So when you combine this, fast change, small budget, inconsistent, it's not for the faint of heart. It's extremely exciting, but it's different. And in pharma, again, the resources tend to be large, but they can be changeable. The hand that giveth sometimes taketh away. So this is sort of if you take nothing away from what I'm going to tell you, if you just have all of these, keep this in your head, I think you'll be able to calibrate what you hear and maybe where you want to go yourself in your. Okay, so let's go on to some specific numbers I thought you'd find useful. So if we just take the two broad categories, academia and government on one side and biotech and pharma on the other, there's two big differences other than what we talked about already. The first is that academia and government work disproportionately on the more basic side, and that makes perfect sense. Remember, its product is knowledge, and so that's what basic research produces, and everything else is dependent on those basic insights. So that is the right thing for academia and government to do, and there is some amount of translational research. I think if we were to put translational science in here, it would be a tiny sliver of translational research, and you can imagine my opinion on that. That I think there's a lot more needed there, but that's a different talk. And then there's the clinical research, which academia and government do a lot of too, but they're not clinical trials. They're not generally regulatorily directed clinical trials, and not everyone realizes that there's a difference between clinical research and clinical trials. Everybody, I think, is familiar with say comparative effectiveness research versus a novel clinical trial for a novel therapeutic. But there's an awful lot of mechanistic clinical research, which is really important. But it's clinical research, not a clinical trial to develop a new therapy. Now, the biopharma industry is upside down, that it does some basic research. 30 years ago, it did a lot more basic research than it does now. It's really these triangles have become even more complementary over the last 30 or 40 years. So there's a minority of basic research, a lot of translational research, which we might call preclinical translation, the topic of today, and then all the clinical research. And the reason this is so large is, of course, that the registration trials, particularly for a common disease, could cost one trial could cost $500 million to $1 billion for one trial, and you can imagine if you multiply that by the hundreds, the number is extremely large. And you also notice the difference in total budget. So this is 2022, so it's last year, but the biopharma industry spent about 4 to 5 times as much in total as academia and government did, and a lot of that has to do with the disproportionate expense of clinical research relative to basic research. I mean, just think about a clinical trial versus where I started working on C. elegans. C. elegans are a lot easier to keep care and fed than humans, and so the costs are generally much. So you're all familiar with this, and I don't need to bewail it or bemoan it because you know this already. I just want, for the purposes of this talk, it's important to keep in mind, because this is what biotech investors are thinking every single day, and they're thinking, well, gosh, if I got a company that's in the preclinical stage here, much less in the drug discovery stage, what is the likelihood that I'm going to get any financial return for my investment? And remember, because knowledge, it doesn't get you anything. You might discover something really, really important, but from an investor standpoint, unless that can be monetized, it's not important. So there's a lot of skepticism based on the data that, given the failure rates that we're all familiar with in drug discovery, which I hasten to put in a plug for translational science. the purpose of translational science is to change this, right? It's to make that funnel larger. But again, a different talk. The current state of the art is that biotech investors have to be thinking, well, gosh, I have to meet the fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders and not waste their money. I mean, these are people's retirement accounts, for heaven's sake. So I have to be very careful with what I'm going to invest in and realize that the success rate is really distressingly low. And so the attitude that investors have is pretty harsh, even harsher than a study section. But that's because they're driven by the data. They would love these things to be true, but they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, so they have to be really quite hard-boiled about this. And these are the numbers. I just want to remind you, these are outdated. This is from Steve Paul's paper back when he was still at Lilly 13 years ago, and these numbers are a little bit different now. I mean, the cost per launch there is well over $1 billion now. But the success rate is probably about the same, 4% overall. If you haven't read this paper, do have a look, because it's the numbers are probably changed a little bit, but I don't think the percentages have too much. Okay, so valley of death. There's two valleys of death. There's the scientific valley of death in drug development, and probably everybody on this call feels like you're that semi-dead or dead skeleton there at the bottom that you're trying to get across there, and most of the time in the valley of death you die, which is why it's called the valley of death. And the purpose of NCATS, of course, is to eliminate the valley of death, right? To fill in this chasm in the middle so that you can walk more efficiently from left side to the right side. That is why I'm so enthusiastic about the NCATS mission and translational science mission. But the fact is that the empirical observation is that most of these therapies never make it from the left side to the right side. But there's an equivalent valley of death in biopharma value creation. So I just want to take you through this a little bit. So the way investors are thinking, and this is not just the way they're paying attention to empirical truth of what happens, is that there are two major sort of epochs of value creation. One is in what this author wonderfully called the hope premium. That's when you have a discovery and everyone says, my gosh, this is going to change the world. Everything is different. All the old rules don't apply. And therefore, this is going to be a multi-billion dollar opportunity. Sometimes that happens. But we as human beings, I think we're all aware that we tend to, as has been said by many people, we tend to overestimate the value of a discovery in the short term and undervalue it in the long term. But so there's a lot of biotechs, and we saw this happen during COVID-19, probably more than we've ever seen, has ever been seen in biotech before, where there was a huge hope premium in all of biotech and pharma because of the exceptional cases of COVID-19 therapies and vaccines having been developed in a very short time, a year to two. So 1/10 as much time as it normally takes. So there was a huge hope premium. A lot of investors got into the market, but this also happens with individual discoveries. And unfortunately, going from that euphoria to actually going in the lab and doing the hard work to figure out, well, gosh, how do I translate this observation into an intervention that's actually going to work in preclinical models and eventually in people, that is a long slog. And that's all of the work that we do, preclinical development and even into people, where the value creation really comes in again. And we've seen this in the last few years in a big way, is in 2A, right? Because in a phase 2A study, it's the first time you really get an idea of safety and efficacy. And I think we're all aware from previous talks in this series that 90% of drugs which go into people never get approved. And so, even if you're in a phase 1 trial, you're a long way from an approval. And remember, an approval is what gives you allows you to sell the drug and gives you a return on your investment. So there is this long period of time in the investment valley of death where investors are having, for a period of up to 10 years, or sometimes even longer, they are having to keep the faith, as it were, that the hope that they had at the beginning is still alive. And so one of the roles that one has to have as a biotech CEO is to be a proselytizer of sorts, and to keep the faith that the science is really going to deliver. Of course, that means that the science has to continue to progress. For the most part, with well-known exceptions, I think we're all aware of, most CEOs are not able to keep investors in without actually having data that's real. So the data is the coin of the realm, but the timeline is so long, and the investors have a shorter time frame, generally of 2 to 3 to 4 years. There is a really important difference. And then, of course, once you get into commercial realm, then the return really comes in. Something that you might want to talk about at this webinar, it's a little bit outside of your limited, the more discrete goal, but the Inflation Reduction Act, some of you may know, has created some remarkably potentially disruptive to investment incentives, which will decrease that yellow bar on the right there. And the fear is, we've already started to see this happen, that if the commercial return is less, the investment at the beginning will be less. There's no way around that. And where that will what that will impact is investment in translational and clinical science and biopharma. A different topic, but really important for all of you to be aware of. Okay, so how does this all work? And I should say, I had heard all these terms before I came to Flagship and Vesalius, but I really didn't know what they mean. There are a couple of ways to envision this. I'll put it in the vernacular, sort of vocabulary phase first, and then the ABCD stage that you may have heard of before. But there's this idea of what the seed stage is, and frequently this money comes from friends and family, metaphorically or in reality. There's lots of companies that have been funded by the founders' credit cards. Less so in biotech because it's so expensive, but certainly in tech this happens. And it's an early sort of divination stage. One might think about it if we're thinking about an NIH grant, this would be coming up with the idea, reading the literature, and generating some preliminary data, metaphorically. And the early stage is when one actually goes out to demonstrate that there is something useful, what's called here an MVP, minimal viable product, that comes out of this is the biotech equivalent of the minimal publishable unit, MPU, that you may have heard of in academia. And you have to establish not only that this thing is viable, but there's actually a customer base who will buy this, and you can get a return on your investment. And then in the growth stage, you have already shown that this proof of principle can apply, and then you to simplify it, oversimplify it. It's a lather, rinse, repeat sort of stage where you're looking to scale to bigger markets, get into additional indications or therapeutic areas, expanding the team to professional management, a C-suite, so-called, and having a steady growth so you can return investment. And then at the expansion stage, you're really getting into being a mature company, and somewhere along here you decide to go public, and that's the exit stage. And in that case, you're either the company's either being acquired by a larger company, or it goes public on the public markets. Up until this point, all of the capital is private. There's no stock which has been issued, and so you may have options, but those options are not liquid. That is, that there's no, you can't sell them because there's no market. There's nobody to sell it to, and the reason that's important, particularly for the ecosystem, it's important for the people in the company, but the important thing is that is how the investors get their money back, right, in order to invest that money that they just made in this IPO back into early pre-seed or seed companies. And it's only that IPO exit from an investment point of view, which allows that to happen. And I'll come to this in a second, because there's some changes that have happened in the last couple of years that have made this really challenging. So the other way you've probably heard about this is seed funding, Series A, B, C, maybe D and E. Not all companies do a Series D and E, and then an IPO in the public markets. And again, the IPO delivers the liquidity back to the investor, who can then invest in new seed and new Series A companies. And the company, just for the sake of where I am, when I first got here, it was at a seed Series A stage. Now we're at a Series B stage, just as an example. Okay, so a couple of things, and then I'm going to finish up here. A couple of things which just to reflect on the environment since I arrived. As I've pointed out to some of you before, my timing was exquisitely problematic in coming to Flagship and Vesalius. I got here in the late spring of 2021, and you notice that year the amount of biopharma seed funding, all the series I just told you about, was historically robust, really above what it had ever been. Then about halfway through that year, for a variety of reasons we could talk about if you're interested, the market it began to really run into problems, and the funding environment changed dramatically within 3 to 4 months. Remember what I said about the rapid rate of change, and that's continued to happen in 23. So now imagine that you were a company like mine that is completely dependent on Series A, B, C, D, other funding, and the funding looks like this. Imagine if you were funded by NIH. Those of you who are at NIH, think if your budget went down by 3/5 in 2 years. That would have a pretty significant impact on what you could do. But that's what's happened in the public markets. So this rate of change and inconsistency is just a problem. It can be a great thing on the upside, but not so great thing on the downside. Those of you who invest in the stock market and individual stocks know what I'm talking about. But this has had a profound impact on biotech. The same things happen in IPOs. You remember I said that an IPO, for the most part, is the way that investors get their liquidity back, their invested dollars back, with a rate of return. So they made a 8x, 10x, 20%, 20x return over that period of time, and then they take that money and they invest it in new companies. And because the IPO market has essentially collapsed, I think that's a good word for this. It's been that has accentuated this phenomenon because the investors can't get their money out because then IPOs aren't happening. So it's all reinforcing itself. The last thing to know, all of you, this is something I think most people don't realize. We're all familiar with the fact that a founder has a very large amount of his or her company when the company starts. But what this shows you is that the way funding works, because you are required to raise money from outside investors to fund your organization, even if you have a very high amount of the company stock when you start, by the time it goes public, you own a very, very, very small amount. Now, hopefully, that is offset by the fact that the company now has a real value. Right. So if your percent goes down, 90%, the value of the stock goes up 100% or 200% or 500%, then you still make a good return on your investment. But I always find there are folks who think, wow, gosh, I own 33% of the company. When it goes public, I'll still own 33% of the company. No, because you have to. The way you're raising money, remember, is that you are giving your investors equity in your company as a quid pro quo for them funding what you want to do. Okay, so all of this needs translational science. For heaven's sake, it needs translational science. And translational science, as you all know, includes not just the scientific, but the operational issues. And those of you who've been around NCATS a while know that we talk about these kinds of financial issues all the time, because finance, as I've just shown you, is one of the major reasons why drugs don't make it to people. It's not the only reason, of course. There's a lot of scientific reasons too, but innovation in finance comes firmly within the realm of translational science from my point of view, just like regulatory sciences. And so you've all, I hope, seen this and have it burned into your hippocampi. But when I look at these, and I ask myself, at my new company, which ones of these do I have to worry about? I can tell you every single one of them, with the possible exception of the ones on the right column toward the bottom. But all of the other ones, these are huge impediments to doing what I want to do here. And unlike when I was in NCATS or when you're in the government, I have no ability to use investors' money to solve these problems. And that would be a misuse of those funds, because these are not going to return investment for investors for the most part. And so what NCATS does, or what translational scientists do, is absolutely critical. Just a few things to finish on a positive note, is I do want to reflect on where I think we are, and I want to look back on major epochs in the biopharmaceutical industry. And it's interesting to look back. It wasn't even 100 years ago before we had all of the medicines pretty much that we now have. And it is extraordinary to remember that antibiotics, endocrine therapies, hypertension, recombinant proteins, monoclonal antibodies, gene therapy, CRISPR, CAR-T, mRNA vaccines, all of this has happened essentially in my lifetime. I'm not quite that old in 1948, but and just so when we get down on how hard this is, because it is hard, realize that the data show us that this field that we are in continues to expand, and in what it can do in increasingly rapid ways, and there's no reason to think this won't stop. And just an example, what we used to think of as a drug back in the 60s, which was a small organic compound, small molecule. All drugs were small molecules, essentially, with the exception of insulin and a few others, but extracts. And now that's not true. All of these are also drugs. And so this means that everything that translational science does to get these out of the lab into people who need them is even more important than it ever was before. I can tell you at Flagship, there are companies, there's about 100 companies in the Flagship ecosystem, and every one of these is represented within the Flagship ecosystem. And you can imagine combining a novel disease insight with a novel modality can go really well. And Flagship was the founder of Moderna, so things can go well, but a lot of times they don't. But it requires all the ingenuity that all of you have. I'm just going to finish here with what Flagship does, because it's different. So I've shown you what's the same. I'll show you what's different now. Just as an example, so Flagship had this idea that, well, gosh, there have got to be general rules by which a new company is formed and become successful. And if this sounds like NCATS, working on general principles, that's accurate. So instead of being a kind of one-off process, the whole idea is there has to be a way to codify the fundamental principles by which this works, and that's how Flagship is different from the many other venture capital firms, et cetera, that are out there that fund biotechs. And the way it does this is a little bit different. That there's a lot of ideas which are generated internally, just like happens at NIH or within an institution or within an NIH institute, and to think about, well, gosh, are there really fundamentally different things that we can't do now that we can envision, and would this actually be possible? Reducing it to practice, and then eventually, if it's successful, forming a new co. And most of the time, as you might imagine, those early explorations are not successful. But eventually, by the time a new company is formed, there's a lot of preliminary data, and it has a higher probability of success as a growth company. Okay, so I'm going to finish with this one, and you all know this one, I hope. That is the reason I come back to this discovery, development, and deployment map that was created initially by a group at the Drug Development and Translation roundtable at the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, but really kept going at Flagship, including via this electronic version. The reason I show you this is that it's a different way of thinking about that ecosystem that I showed you at the beginning with the New Yorker cover. What we're looking at here is the different kinds of science that these groups do. And when you look at a map like this, you realize that none of us can be experts in more than a couple of these. Or maybe if you're a decathlete, maybe you can be an expert in 10 of them, but there's 90 of them that you don't know. And so the reason I show you this is that what I'd urge all of you to do is not only in your scientific life, but also in your operational life, and the way you think about funding, the way you think about the other partners, whether they're in government or biotech or big pharma or academia, wherever it is, to realize that they have a different point of view, but that we all need each other, and that's the only way that we're going to be successful. Let me just finish by telling you, and I'm just going to stop sharing here, that this has been an enormously both exciting and humbling last 2.5 years for me, and I would urge all of you who have an interest and the stomach to get into this kind of space to consider doing so. It's a very, very exciting space, and I think, given the difficulties that the field has been through, as I showed you over the last few years, I'm extremely optimistic that the financial markets will recover, as they always do, and that the remarkable science that we see around us every day will lead to another golden age in biotech. So thank you. Glad to take any questions or whatever we have time for.
Chris, thank you so much. This was really enlightening, and I learned so much from this presentation, and thank you for sharing all of this really important knowledge. There are questions. I do want to ask a question myself, actually. So I was wondering what would be the basis of the fluctuations in the series funding. So you were saying in 2022 there was less funding, 2018 more funding, or whatever. What drives that?
Yeah, it's a great question. In this case, it's three things. Biotech is famously cyclical. It's like oil and gas. It always goes up and down and up and down. It's just a matter of sentiment. It's beyond a point. It's like the stock market. And so some of it is that cyclicity. But in my opinion, most of it was two other things. One was a hangover from the euphoria of COVID. So what happened during COVID was that, and we all remember this because we lived through it, the entire industry pivoted pretty much, to COVID. And billions of dollars were assigned to one disease. And virtually the entire research infrastructure was working on one disease. And regulatory flexibilities, clinical trial flexibilities, all kinds of things which were put in place to accelerate development. And that's fantastic. A lot of us are still here because those things happened. But what happened in the investment community was that there was a generalization of that, where people who probably should have known better thought, well, gosh, the world's completely different now. It's for every disease, we're going to have a new drug in a year, 2 years, instead of 20 years. And the success rates are going to be, 5 times what they were before. That changes my net present value dramatically. So I'm going to get out of, video games, and I'm going to put all my money into biotech. And then when it turned out that, oh no, this was an exception, the rules are still pretty much the same. All those people said, "Oi, well, I'm getting out of this. I'm going back to video games," because remember, that's their job, is to make money for their investors. So there was a huge this hope euphoria, which led to irrational exuberance, if you want to call it that, from Alan Greenspan's famous statement. But the other, and really the thing that was the nail in the coffin for this funding, was the increase in interest rates. So up until a couple of years ago, interest rates were effectively zero. What that means is that an investor who has to make money for his or her clients can't keep their money in cash, because you're not going to make any money for your investment. So you have no choice but to invest in biotech or other more risky investments. Now, then overnight, literally within 6 months, interest rates went from 0 to 8%. So now those same investors can get 8% per year on their money with no risk. Mm. So those investors say, I would love to invest in biotech, but I can't meet, that is not a responsible thing for an investor to do, to risk people's money when I can make them 8%, which is a very good return, with absolutely no risk. So those 3 things, it was the cyclicity, it was COVID, and it was interest rates.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Chris. You have many questions. So we only have a few minutes left. Do you mind if you stay a little over to take those questions? Thank you. I appreciate it. And this is for attendees. If you could like some of these questions that interest you the most, then we can take the ones that are the most interesting to you all. All right, so we'll start with the first question, Chris. This is from Sita. So he says, great talk. Can you recommend on the effect of AI? Can you comment, on the effect of AI on drug discovery and development in the next decade? There is obviously a lot of hype. How is the biopharma and pharma addressing this?
Yeah, there is a lot of hype, and remember that, the hope premium, and then it always comes back down again. We're all familiar with that. However, I do think, and my own company does this, I do think that this is as general a tool that will accelerate many, many things as molecular biology was before. And molecular biology didn't change everything, but it changed a lot of things. So it allowed us to do things that we simply couldn't do before. And the reason is that it allows the kind of parametric thinking that the human brain just isn't very good at. Human brain is good at X by Y, but X by Y, as all of us remember from differential equations class, you can't have 100 independent variables. Your brain explodes. But for a computer, yeah, sure, I can do it. And so it's particularly when we're talking about the complexity of the human body, the ability to consider all those possible outcomes simultaneously is huge. Now, the problem that Sita knows, as well as everybody will do, is that unlike in other areas, like in chat or in finance, the data are not uniform enough or complete enough to be able to accurately compute on in many indications. Computational chemistry is an example, it's an exception, but for a lot of things that I want to do, it's the data to compute on is simply not there. And so we as a community are going to have to generate a new kind of data. And those of you who remember what QHTS is, was one of the reasons. It was long before AI, but the idea was we want to have a kind of data that is robust enough that we can compute on it. And so that's big. The other thing that's changed though is the understanding of genetics, so that allowing a kind of modularity of therapies, or programmability, many people call it, that was simply impossible before, that we can't do with small molecules because we just don't understand the rules. They're much more complicated, but it's becoming possible to predict effects of, let's say, genetic polymorphisms. You've probably seen this in some of the literature more recently, with some accuracy, actually. And there's a company at Flagship called Generate, which is using generative AI to make new antibodies which have a completely different amino acid structure, but bind into the same epitope of a target. Something that would, if you had to do that by brute force, it would take you 100 years. But AI can do it extremely quickly. So I think there are real applications, but you just have to look at whether the data are sufficient or whether we got to generate the data.
Thanks, Chris. So many questions are coming in. So let's take a few more. All right. So there's a question here. The question goes, how do we better disseminate our research discoveries to biotech stakeholders beyond publications and our translational findings into the general public to educate, regain trust?
Yeah. Depending on where you are, the conventional route, of course, if you're an academic, the conventional route is your tech transfer office, which some of which are extremely sophisticated, others not, others less so. The other thing that I would encourage anyone to do is cold call, frankly, and realize that there's all of these venture capitalists are out there with investors' money. Let's think about it from their point of view, and they know they have to find the best, most translational or most transformational ideas out there, but they realize that they're at a severe disadvantage. How do they find them? And so you may think that you're bothering these people, but you're actually doing them a huge favor by letting them know that you're out there. Because there is there's no dating app for biotech. That's really what we need. So you can swipe right or swipe left or whatever it is, but there is no such thing. So it's really more like it's like going to an online singles bar and approaching one person at a time, but realize that the people you're talking to want to talk to you, because that's the only way they're going to be able to make a living.
That's awesome. Thank you, Chris. All right, next question here is, with so many rare diseases in need of therapies, how do you see this drug development model changing to accommodate the need?
Yeah, one of my favorite subjects, as you know. It's to do many diseases at a time, and I think this is becoming increasingly possible via the class effects that I think we're seeing possible now. Whether and these are mainly genetic, or exclusively really genetic therapies, whether they're ASOs, the kind of work that Tim Yu's been doing, or their gene therapy, the kind of work that the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium has been doing, or one of my current favorites is a flagship company focused on engineered tRNAs. It's called Alterna, and that is focused on doing hundreds of rare diseases at a time by changing the anticodon within tRNAs and fooling the translational machinery into thinking that that it's actually a correct codon, not a stop codon. And so that means that, and then of course the ultimate is gene editing, right? Because there's only a certain number of misspellings out there, and the hope is that, I think there's every reason to believe, if we can solve the delivery problem, this will be possible. that there's only 4 nucleotides, right? I mean, there's only A, C, T, and G. So all, quote unquote, you got to be able to do is fix each one of those, and you've solved every rare disease that's caused by a single polymorphism. Of course, the other ones, more larger rearrangements and chromosomal abnormalities are more difficult. But we could not possibly have considered that even 20 years ago. We couldn't have thought about that. But it's really within the realm of possibility now. The problem is delivery, and it's always been the problem. And safety too, of course.
Thanks, Chris. Next question here, what resources would you recommend for scientists interested in learning more about venture capital and this complex ecosystem?
The best place is actually the Venture Capital Association and the Bio website and the Pharma website, but also make a plug for a book by someone that the NCATS folks know, whose name is Andrew Lowe. He is last name is L.O., first name is Andrew. Is a finance professor at MIT. NCATS has done some work with him over the years. And he wrote what I think is the most understandable book on healthcare finance. I think it's actually called Healthcare Finance. And it's written for people who have a scientific background but don't know a lot about finance. And it's written for people like us who are scientists. And I couldn't recommend that highly enough.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. I know you're getting tired, but there's so many more questions. Do you mind if you take maybe 1 or 2 more?
Yeah, one or more. Yeah, then I got to run.
Okay, one more, and then how does biotech view assets developed at DPI NCATS, like small molecules that have de-risked approaches and demonstrated preclinical POC?
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at the success of a program like Trend, it sort of speaks for itself that that they are viewed extremely positively because of, I would say, the foundational principles of DPI and other organizations, academic or government organizations that are organized this way, that have the expertise, the technical expertise, drug development expertise, and knowledge, which normally is resident in a biotech or a pharma, plus the deep biology expertise that is normally resident and is resident in an academic organization. And you put those two together, then you are going to come up with an asset of outsized value. There's just no way around it, because normally you have one or the other. And that's why I think the DPI assets are in my experience, are viewed very favorably by biopharma.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Chris, this was amazing. I think there's a lot to talk about, and it seems like we have a lot of questions. We need to redo this and do a round 2 at some point, and maybe invite you here at NCATS and have some roundtable discussions and so on. This was extremely helpful. Again, on behalf of everyone at NCATS, all of our attendees, we're very thankful for you willing to share all this rich information with us.
My pleasure. Right. It's great to see you all.
All right, you too.
Take care. Right,
everyone, you all have a good time, and join us in the 2024 AGM Preclinical Translational Science webinar series that we're going to launch hopefully soon, early next year. You have a good one.